Oh, so you quite a night owl generally, I suppose?
Yes, a night owl is my time.
Yeah,
I had a little early evening doze between 8 and 9, and now I'll be up all night now.
yeah. So you tend to sort of your sleep pattern tends to sort of differ with the weather or spring or
When it's the
um,
summer, I get up more because it's in the sunshine.
yeah,
But in the winter, and also I've been more nocturnal in the winter because especially when it's really cold in the day. And also with lockdown, I've become even more nocturnal because you can just do what you like, you know. But when I go back to working properly, it'll be a bit different because it's not just the evening I have to work. Sometimes you have to leave quite early to get to places, and you actually have to be up, you know.
yeah.
So then I have to go to bed at night. That's my job.
That is your job. I mean, have you got the shirt and tie on? Are you what's going on underneath? Have we got the
Well,
box?
I wouldn't like to say, but I'm not necessarily as smart below as above.
Yeah, well, no, I'm the same. I've got my pajama bottoms on.
Yeah, I got pajama bottom on as well,
Yeah.
under below.
Yes, yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
I think it's a bit dark. Do you think I'm a bit dark?
Uh,
Do you think we need 2,700 watt LED bulb on me? I think we might.
I thought, go on, do it, do
Let's
it.
what difference that makes. 2,000. Hang on, I just got to turn that like that.
Wow.
3,000. Sorry, I made a mistake. It was 3,200.
Well, I just noticed that straight away. Just it was
Yes,
like,
that's a bit brighter with the 3,200 kilowatts on me.
yeah.
Oh, I'm going to test this one. I don't think I need this one, but I'm going to test it because I knocked it over yesterday. Oh, it works fine.
Oh, there we go.
Yes, yes, 3,200 watts.
Ah, was that what God was like? Do you think when he was sort of let there be light and he was figuring out the lighting for the earth?
Yeah, he would have been like that. Yes.
Yeah. So
With
we
all the
have.
different, and you can have 3,000. You can have hot or cold. I've got hot, but you can have cold lighting. I've got the warmest lighting possible.
Well, that.
At the brightest, 3,200 kilowatts or megawatts or whatever it is.
Well, how you been doing over COVID this last year? How have you been
Well, it's been quite
coping?
nice, really.
Okay.
I mean, I've enjoyed the lockdown and the opportunity to write and so on. Then in more recent times, I have, and I've only done two live shows since last March, and it's all been Zoom shows, which have been really fun, connecting with the people who follow me on the Zoom, and my people who watch my Zoom shows, and doing lots of writing, and sometimes just enjoying sort of life in a way that one couldn't before because it was always so busy, just seeing friends and neighbours and so on. Well, not friends from afar, but neighbours and things like that. I think in more recent times, it's become a bit harder. It seems like it's harder to be creative. I think in the latter times because it's so long with so little stimulation. In fact, I was reading something online about how lots of authors who write crime novels or whatever they write, and they were all saying the same, that the first lockdown they found a real release because it meant there was a fewer distractions and so on. But then the later lockdowns, they just found that they just felt fewer ideas because they were just stuck with the same walls all the time. So I feel a bit like that now. And then I feel sort of hopeful for the future now with the vaccines and with things we hope getting back to normal. But of course, we have to remember, I mean, they're talking about hospitality being one of the latest things to go back to normal, and maybe airlines even later, and then probably theatres even later. I mean, that's the last thing. In fact, no one's really mentioning theatres, but that's the thing that's going to be affected, probably the latest of anything. And I suppose it's all right for someone like me because I'm established and I have my Zoom people who watch me, and that gives me something to do. And of course, I'm reasonably established. But I think for some people who are newer or for actors, it must be ever so hard because they must be facing very much financial troubles and just, no hope of anything to do for a long time. And so I'm more hopeful now, although a little bit concerned, because I think that if anything happens, for example, I've got a tour this autumn, which has of course been rescheduled at least twice. It's supposed to happen last autumn and so on. So I've got that tour coming up this autumn, and this has involved a lot of patience, not from me particularly. It's easy for me, I just allow them to reschedule it, but from all the people, the promoters and the theatres and all the people who have been rescheduling it. They haven't made any money from that. They've just been doing a load of administration and spending money on promotions and things, and not necessarily with any hope of anything happening. So that's all happening this autumn. And then the only concern is that if we go backwards for some reason, it looks like we should go forwards, vaccine and all. But if we go backwards to some sort of new variant and something happens, and then, for example, if that tour doesn't happen, it won't just be my tour, it'll be everyone's tour, then it will almost destroy our industry. I mean, there'll be a lot of theatres that will go bust, and that will be very bad news. And we might even get to the point where a lot of people like me will have to think, well, if we're going to be in that sort of situation with no certainty whatsoever, what exactly will my job be? Am I going to be just a writer or some other thing within comedy? But I hope it doesn't come to that.
Hopefully not.
I hope that things come normal in the autumn, and with a bit of luck, there'll even be a bit of a boost, because people will be desperate to go to shows and so on, because they haven't been able to for so long.
Yeah. What do you think about like the anti-vaxxers, I guess, that are convinced that Bill Gates is going to track us all and to have his way with us, apparently?
Well, I try not to think about it too much, because I have to keep calm and not sort of get cross. But one does feel, I mean, I've read quite a lot about it, and the reasons, and there's a lot of misinformation. I mean, there was this thing with the AstraZeneca with the over 65s in Europe, and that was based on the fact that they hadn't tested it on as many over 65s as on younger age groups. The reason being, of course, they didn't want to just test it on a load of older people who might, if it wasn't safe, they wanted to test it on younger people first to make sure. But then it wasn't that it didn't work on the over 65s. In fact, all the evidence shows it does work, just there wasn't as much evidence for the over 65s as for some of the other age groups. And then that was then changed by some of the Europeans, like Emmanuel Macron, said it was quasi ineffective for the over 65s. It's just not true. And then that now means that a lot of people in Europe are refusing to take that. And in fact, actually, the evidence now is showing that in the over 65s and the over 70s and the older age groups, the AstraZeneca jab is reducing hospital admissions by 94%. So it's showing it does work. But it just goes to show how silly little things become misinformation, and then people say, and then now in Europe, that has now become, with Chinese whispers and so on, into, well, if it doesn't work on the over 65s, which itself isn't true, if it doesn't work on those, it doesn't really work on the younger people either, so I'm not taking it, it's not safe, and all this sort of stuff. A lot of the anti-vaxxer stuff is based on, I think, three things. One, that it can give you serious illnesses, which is not true. Vaccines do not give serious illnesses. Two, that it can give you the disease that it's attempting to stop you getting, which is not true. It can give you mild symptoms of it, but it's not true that it can give you the disease. So those are the sort of things, and and then there's other nonsense like it's full of microchips that Bill Gates, and it's laughable. But there are people who believe this sort of stuff, and it's very selfish, really, because I mean it's the same with people who won't have their children vaccinated for mumps and measles and things. We don't have mumps and measles in this country very much at the moment. That's because most people are vaccinated. But actually, they're starting to creep back in some countries, in some parts of the world, because there are so many anti-vaxxers. So, there's a lot of discussion at the moment about Well, should it be, what about civil liberties? Should one be allowed to go to a restaurant if one hasn't been vaccinated? I'm not sure it will come to that. I imagine, I don't know whether there will be restaurants that will say you can't come in if you haven't been vaccinated. I should point out that if people haven't been vaccinated because they've got a genuine medical reason for not doing it, I think those people should be allowed
Mhm.
to go in. They should have a thing. That's fair enough. We can have a small number of people who haven't been vaccinated for medical reasons, and then the vaccine will still work. When it won't work is if a lot of people decide they're just arbitrarily not going to have it. So I don't think that will quite happen in the restaurants, although I wouldn't mind if it did. But certainly, what I know from my travels around the world is places like Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, countries like that will not take any risks, and they will not allow people in if they haven't been vaccinated.
Mhm.
So a lot of people will find that their freedoms of movement are restricted if they're not vaccinated. And that's a problem, isn't it, I suppose?
Yeah. Well, I suppose we're sort of living in a time more now than ever where we have the fake news and misinformation sort of really apparent on, especially on social media and things like this. And I suppose with Trump as well, Trump, who was someone that was a president that was kind of saying, well, I'm not sure if I would take the vaccine, but then he would say things like, maybe we can inject ourselves with bleach at the same time. So it was,
Right.
it's just
I mean, it's
laughable, isn't it?
laughable, but it just increases the sense of people not trusting government and
Mhm.
science. But of course, if you don't trust something, it's right to not. It's right to be uh, suspicious in a way of and questioning of things. That's a good thing in human nature, and to say, well, is that true? Is that, you know? But if you're going to hold scientists and politicians to that, and government really, I don't mean politicians in a political sense, but government, if you're going to hold them to that level of accountability and that level of question, then you also have to do the same for what you read on Facebook. So if you think, well, you know, it's not good enough just to say, oh well, I'm not sure about this and that, and something doesn't add up. Oh, but I've also read on Facebook that Bill Gates has injected it all with vaccine with a microchip. If you think that, you have to then question that to the same level and say, well, how did you get the microchips into the vaccine? How does it work? How do the microchips feed back to Bill Gates? And more fundamentally, why is Bill Gates interested in, you know, where I'm going for a walk? Anyway, I doubt he is. But anyway, yes, you know, so I mean, I'd be quite happy for Bill Gates to know where I'm going
I
personally.
know, yeah, to show interest.
But there seems to be a lack of logic,
Mhm.
and it's this sort of sense of, well, you know, who can say, you know? I mean, I remember someone saying, well, they said, well, humans, men as they were in those days, they never went to the moon. And I said, okay, you know, if you
Mhm.
want to believe that, you can believe it. And then there were various reasons, something to do with a flag or something, and something to do with a shadow on a flag, and some other reason. And I said, okay, fine. And they said, well, you know, so, and their reasons were based, one of the reasons was based on the fact that someone once at a conference questioned, I think it was Buzz Aldrin or Neil Armstrong or one of the other astronauts, and said, what do you think about the idea that it's not true and no one ever went to the moon? And I think the astronaut stormed out. It's very anecdotal evidence. I mean, he may well have stormed out because he was fed up with being asked the same question, having gone, you know, can you imagine the amazing experience of putting your life at risk for a start, because they didn't know whether they were going to come back. It's very dangerous. Flying into orbit and then getting to the moon. It took about 4 days to get 250,000 miles, orbiting the moon, then landing on the moon, then not knowing even whether you were going to be able to take off again from the moon and come all the way back. I mean, it was so technologically amazing experience, seeing the Earth from the distance, this little blue thing and the emptiness of space and all this sort of stuff. And they all had all sorts of experiences, some quite sort of almost sort of spiritual experiences of realizing why are we all fighting each other? Why is there so much war and strife? We're all on this beautiful planet and we're all so vulnerable within the blackness of space. And you get back and all these people are saying, well, we never went there. It must be quite annoying. Anyway, so that was one of the pieces of evidence in inverted commas, and there are other things. So I said, well, and then they said, well, that they must have paid off. What they would have done is paid off they gave the politicians, the astronauts money, you know, to pretend that they had been, even though they hadn't. So I said, okay, well, if this had happened and no one had been to the moon, it wouldn't just be the 14, I think it was, astronauts. There would also have to be a significant number of other people who would also know that no one had ever been to the moon. There'd be a lot of people on the ground. And I mean, it would be difficult to imagine that you could stage such a thing without at least dozens, probably hundreds of people knowing. There'd have to be a lot of people who knew.
Yeah, well, that's the same.
And so all of those people would have to all decide to take a vow of silence, either because they just decide that's the best thing to do, that's the right thing to do, and not a single one of them ever thought, do you know, I ought to reveal that it's actually not true. Or they were all paid sort of hush money to keep quiet. But then there would be several hundred or scores of people who would all have lots of money. They would all have had lots of mysterious money would have gone into their bank accounts. Or they would all have been shot by the Secret Service or something to keep them quiet, but they weren't. So if you're going to think they didn't go to the moon, you have to then justify the other side of the story. It's not just enough to say, ooh, the flagpole, something about the shadow's not right. Ooh, they didn't go to the moon then. You have to justify the other side. And it's the same with the anti-vaxxers. If you think it doesn't work or it's dangerous, you have to justify it to the same level the others are justifying it. Or else shut up.
Yeah,
that's what I think.
It's the same. It's a time we're living in with conspiracies, isn't it? And it's, I think, the most angriest, the one that makes me most angriest is probably the ones that, you know, people that claim that 9/11 was like an inside job and things like that. Again, how does something on that scale happen with so many people being involved, and planes and Pentagon, the buildings coming down, the Pentagon, and that plane that sort of crashed into a field? But there's people in America, especially, there's been big documentaries about people that feel that they've got evidence or truth or whatever to point things out.
Well, yes, I mean, if that were the case, let's say for the sake of argument, the president was the one who was behind it, and he decided to do it. But there would have to be a number of other people, and the FBI, CIA, and all sorts of people who would all know. I mean, you can't just, make 9/11 happen without a significant number of people knowing. And then they would all, obviously, then the suicide bombers, they would obviously have known, because they would have had to have been recruited in some way indirectly by the president who was organizing all this, wouldn't they? They would all have to know. And they may well have had to have been people perhaps at the airport doing security who sort of let them through, because they were also in the know that, oh yeah, we're letting them through because they're going to go and do a terrorist attack. That's all from the president. Now, all these people it would be difficult to do it without dozens, scores, probably hundreds of people knowing. And not one of them has ever come forward and said, do you know that this was an inside job? And actually, you know, having thought about it, I've suddenly sort of thought, well, maybe it was wrong for the president of the United States, together with the CIA and other senior figures, to band together in order to kill several thousand American people and make it look like a terrorist attack. Maybe that's wrong. I think I'm going to blow the whistle. No one has done that. But at the same time, they haven't all been shot by the CIA to keep them quiet, nor have they been given loads of money to keep them quiet. But yes, obviously, you know, that's, you know, it's ludicrous, these sort of conspiracies, and it doesn't stack up.
Do you think, I suppose, it comes to it as well with us as humans? Sometimes we feel like when something so crazy like that happens, we can't accept that people, just normal people with box cutters, could go onto a plane and take over a plane. There has to be more reason to it, because it's so, in some people says it's so crazy and so illogical. It has to be a bigger reason for it to for it to have happened.
Yes, I think that's true. It's sort of quasi-religious, really, because it's religion is attempting to find some sort of meaning behind sometimes things which maybe appear on the surface to be meaningless. And it's the same with this, is trying to find some meaning to the fact that prosaically what happened is some people had box cutters and so on and did these terrible things. And indeed it is religious in the sense that if you question these people who have these conspiracy beliefs, you can't win, because because they will just say, if you say, well, there's no evidence of this in the mainstream media, they'll say, well, that's because it's all hushed up, and that's because people in the CIA have paid the people in the media not to say. And if you say, well, what about those people who paid them? Well, someone else paid them, and you can never win, because there's always be some reason. And it is sort of a self-fulfilling argument, isn't it? That the reason it's not officially recognised is because it's all been hushed up. So therefore, you can never argue about it because it's all hushed up. In the same way with religion, you can't really argue with that because, well, that's because you don't believe or you're a non-believer. But if you believe, then all these things are true. So it's the same sort of argument, really, a sort of a circular argument, a sort of argument that you can't argue with. If you say, oh, well, I don't believe this, and I say, well, God has told me, I have a personal connection with God, he's told me this, you can't really win that argument. I mean, I've heard it from God. You can't win it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, how do you feel, I suppose, about censorship? I know obviously we've seen recently, Donald Trump's been taken off Twitter and his social media pages, and he was spouting a lot of stuff on there. But do you feel that kind of fuels his supporters into thinking there is an agenda, like a deep thing agenda, by silencing him, and it riles people up more?
Well, I suppose so. It's difficult though, isn't it? Because at the same time, maybe more damaging to have him saying all this rubbish.
Well, yeah.
In my opinion, mainly rubbish. So we have this all the time with everything, and we do have laws. I mean, you could say freedom of speech says you can say anything, but then we do have laws. You can't go around and just say a load of racially offensive things, because we don't find that acceptable. And as a society, we have to decide what we find acceptable, what we don't. It's always tricky, isn't it? Because there's a whole thing now with the with transgender people, what is acceptable to say and what isn't, and where it gets, of course, difficult is where one set of people feels that they have a legitimate point to make, but they can't make it because they're being told that that's against the rules to say it, and that is rather concerning. I mean, in this country, we don't have any law against Holocaust denial, for example, which is obviously utterly abhorrent and preposterous. I mean, again, ludicrous. I remember I read once something, a Holocaust denial webpage, out of interest to see what other sort of things they were saying. It was very cleverly written, because it was very sort of persuasive, and you sort of thought, for a while, you almost sort of thought, oh, yes, there's just far fewer people than they say. And it was all very cleverly written. But the way I see it is, they say there weren't all these people who died, but then you have to say, well, where did they go? I mean, for example, my great-grandmother, she died in the Holocaust in a concentration camp at Lublin. Well, I can't be certain she died in Lublin. All I know is that our last communication as a family from her was a letter from Lublin concentration camp, which she didn't call Lublin concentration camp because she didn't really know where she was. She just said, I'm in this place called Lublin, and it's a sort of camp thing, and I'm not sure what's going to happen next. All I know, now I can't prove she died, and this is, I suppose, what the Holocaust denial people would say, well, you can't prove she died. She might have come out. All I do know is she was very close to her family for obvious reasons, as most people are. All I do know is that she never got in touch. So anyway, so one was to assume she died there, unfortunately. And the same would apply to the many, many millions of people who had other relatives, Jewish and homosexual and disabled and other people, traveling people and other people who all died. So one has to assume they died. But that's the sort of ludicrous arguments they have, So anyway, I can't remember, what was the point of, what was the question?
Oh, we're talking about censorship, weren't we?
Censorship. Oh, well, censorship. So yes, so to say, so we don't know, so that's what the point is. Holocaust in Ireland is utterly abhorrent, but we don't have laws against it in this country, against actually saying it. There are in Germany, and you can understand why in Germany maybe it's more necessary. And I'm not saying one country is right and one country is wrong. It's complicated. I suppose we have the balance about right. People are allowed to say that. In a way, if you ban people from denying the Holocaust by law, then in a way you give more strength to them in some senses, because then they can say, oh, well, I'm banned from saying it because there's some truth behind it. But then you also give more strength to them if you don't ban it, and there's lots of people saying it. So it's sort of a balance, really. And so there's a difference between what is legally acceptable and what one wants to hear. I mean, if someone came to my house and they were denying the Holocaust and and saying these sort of things, unless, and I'd be interested, I suppose, to discuss it. If someone came to a dinner party and they were saying it, I'd discuss it. But if they were not a very nice person who seemed to have, were not listening to reason, I probably wouldn't want them to come to another dinner party. I probably wouldn't want to be friends with them. But that doesn't mean that they should be banned by law for saying it. So it's a tricky thing. Of course, comedy is one of the sort of last areas of censorship. It's one of the areas where people are, by and large, able to say more or less not what they want, but they're able to, you can get away with saying all sorts of things in comedy that you couldn't say in other fields, and you can sometimes address sort of truths, and you can sometimes say things in a comedy way that it would be very difficult to really address that issue in any other way. And it is on the surface a joke, but underneath there's some truth to it, and maybe something, and there's a bit of an uncomfortable truth to it, or something that makes people think, oh, what is my attitude towards this or that? That's made me think about that in a different way. So well, yes, I mean, fortunately, we do live in a place of free speech, and I know I think in our country, in the UK, and other free countries like our country, because we're used to it, we sometimes underestimate the importance of free speech. And I remember going to a country a few years ago, a very nice country, but it was a country where one wasn't free to say anything you wanted about religion or about the ruling royal family who ran the country. Not that I particularly knew anything much about the ruling royal family who ran the country, and didn't have any bad things to say about them because I didn't know them or know much about them. But anyway, that was the sort of country I was in, and there were all sorts of, you'd be very careful what you said in public. And it was a relief in a way to be on that aeroplane coming home and to know that I could say, oh, I think the Queen's feet smell and I don't like her. And also Princess Anne, the silly old cow. And I think we should not get rid of her. We should, stop her being royal, make her just a normal person. I mean, or whatever I wanted to say. I'm not saying I wanted to say those things, but I could say them if I wanted to. And we underestimate, how big a deal that is to be able to just say what you like about powerful people. And we can say, we're allowed to say, I think Boris Johnson is the best prime minister or the worst prime minister, or he's useless, whatever. But there are other countries where you can't say those things.
Yeah, wouldn't be able to say it in North Korea.
Well, not in North Korea. No, in North Korea. I always think it's scary. I mean, when you see there's sort of footage of Kim Jong Un, and he's meeting the I've forgotten his name. Is it Moon, who's
Oh yeah, I know you mean.
the
Yeah.
president of South Korea, and so on, and all the delegations, they're all jolly and backslapping each other, and it's all, oh, and here, they're all introducing each other, the South Koreans and North Koreans and so on. And then you've got maybe an interpreter and so on, but it's scary. I mean, if you're an interpreter and you get something wrong, you get shot in North Korea. Or if you say the wrong thing or you don't deliver with such and such, you get shot. Scary.
Yeah, it's terrifying. I mean, I even heard of Kim Jong Un, like some of like the kids in North Korea, like they're Kim Jong Un is kind of like the action man in fiction as well. Like kids sort of like not TV, but books they might read or comics or things like that. It's Kim Jong Un is like the hero. He is like the action man, the spy, the Superman of of what kids are reading. It's just crazy. I mean, Donald Trump probably would want to do that as well if he could have got away with it, like Donald Trump as Captain America or something. But yeah, it's crazy, isn't it?
Well, I mean, Donald Trump is what you would say is you could describe him as a democratically elected dictator in a way. But yes, scary. I think being in somewhere like North Korea in the ruling classes would have been a bit like being in the Tudor court or something. I mean, when you read those, I often watch these history documentaries and read a lot about history. And you read these people and it's all power struggles, and there would be so-and-so who became the senior advisor to King Henry VIII or something, and they didn't necessarily last long. 10 years later, they'd fall from favor, or there'd be some political change and then have their head cut off. It was all very, very short-lived, dangerous world of, and if you were a woman and King Henry VIII liked you and you'd get on with him, you'd be in his bed and you'd be in his favor and you could have whatever you wanted, and the next minute you're having your head cut off. Brutal world.
Yes, absolutely brutal. I mean, as a comedian, do you have to be a bit more careful with your writing in terms of, do you worry about offending people a bit more easier now, or have you had to develop that at all? Or
of course, and I have been for many years.
Yeah.
And indeed, I don't want to offend people for the sake of offending people. Sometimes I will say something that causes, not much, not very often, because I suppose I'm not the sort of comedian who necessarily is dealing with the most contentious issues all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And some of it's just really silly. But yes, I will address issues, and occasionally some people will be offended by something. However, this is something, it would not normally come as a surprise to me. If I'm creating something, I'll be thinking, is this going to offend people? And what am I saying here? I'm not just interested in that instance, what laugh I get or how the joke works. I'm also interested in what am I saying as a human being? What am I saying? And I always want to think, yes, can I get behind this? And if someone were to say, either at the end of the show or to heckle and say, excuse me, you're being offensive, you're saying such and such, how would I justify what I'm saying? What is the underlying point? So yes, I have lots of, this is something that's very much in my mind, of course, all the time, when I'm creating that sort of something that is for some reason on the contentious, talking about something that's a little bit contentious. Yes.
Yeah, because I think like with some of the, I guess we've seen it recently, sort of in the news and things like Little Britain and stuff have been pulled off Netflix, and I think Faulty Towers as well has been pulled off. And there's shows that I love to watch as like a teenager and as a kid growing up. But are we? Is there a line somewhere where we can kind of be like that? That's maybe not acceptable now, but this is what it was like then, rather than just kind of pulling it away completely.
Well, I think so. I think in the case of Faulty Towers, I think it was the Germans episode, which actually they did put back up again. Because in fact, I actually did a tweet, which I think was a bit subtle for some people, but I said, it's down, it's up again, which was actually a sort of reverse quote of a bit that happens in that very episode of the Germans, when he's putting the moose up, and then Polly's on the phone to Sybil in the hospital, and she says, it's up, it's down again. But I think the bit in question, because I don't think most of Faulty Towers is not controversial, But I think the bit in question was a bit when the Major and Basil are discussing something, and they're discussing cricketers. And
Yeah.
I think there are two racially words that are used. One that is less used now, and one that is still very, very much one of the most offensive racial words. Of course, the whole point of it is, in a way, that the whole point is that they're making fun of the sort of people who use those words. But obviously the zeitgeist has changed since the 1970s, because now we wouldn't even find it acceptable to use those words in a comedy show, even to make fun of the people who use those words. Those words are so offensive, we just don't want to watch them at all. So that, I suppose, is what is altered. But it should be pointed out that is the point of that bit of the comedy. It's making fun of the Major. The Major is the dinosaur who has racist views. It's making fun of him. Nevertheless, I think, I don't know whether they put it back up, but just deleted those lines. I have seen some edits of Fawlty Towers when those lines are taken out. And I have to say, I love Fawlty Towers. It's one of my very, very favourite programmes. So I don't find that bit necessary. I never found that bit very funny anyway, the sort of using those racist terms and sort of making fun of the Major for being racist. So I think it was the right decision to put it up, and maybe leave those words in, but point out that they're making fun of the racists, and point out that it has a historical context, that those words were sort of acceptable. They were heard in those days. So I suppose that's the context. People did use those words in those days. So therefore, he's making fun of the people who did use those words. When it comes to, I don't know, was it Little Britain, where they were, putting brown on their faces? I mean, I don't know. I mean, one has to sort of, everyone's going to have a different view, but I have to sort of think, do we need to watch that anymore? I mean, can we just take it down? There's lots of bits of very hilarious bits of Little Britain that are very, very funny, and that don't involve that, so we can have all the other bits. It's the same with League of Gentlemen, which I think is hilarious, but I think there's bits there where they put brown on the face, and those bits have been taken away. And I don't think it makes much difference, because League of Gentlemen is effectively, although it has a narrative, it's effectively a sort of sketch show with narrative, and to lose those bits is not the end of the world. So one finds that less acceptable. And certainly, when I remember watching, I don't know, I mean, it's a difficult one, isn't it? I remember watching some sitcom from the 70s, and in it there was a bit where it was making fun of gay people. So there was a man in a pub, and then the pub landlord said, and I think the man in the pub was heterosexual. So he was heterosexual, but the pub landlord said, "Oh, there's a phone call for you." And the joke was supposed to be that he was getting this phone call from a gay bar or something. And the joke was kind of, well, you're heterosexual, but why are you getting a call from a gay bar? I mean, even saying this now seems so out of date.
Yeah.
The 70s. And then it was kind of, oh, there's a call from you. It's from the gay bar. And then he was saying hello, and then all the other people in the pub were saying, oh, talking to his gay friends. I didn't find it very funny, particularly. I mean, it didn't seem to me the most hilarious bit of comedy. I mean, you could argue that should be taken down, because it's just so out of date. And I suppose you could say the comedy there is not very subtle and sophisticated. The comedy is just gay, ha ha ha. I mean, that's all it is. There's nothing more to it. There's no sophistication to it. So I just think the idea of putting that out there now as a piece of comedy is A, dated, and B, slightly offensive, I suppose, in the sense that if people are laughing still at that joke, they probably shouldn't be. Why are people still laughing at that? The idea of, oh, someone's gay, ha ha ha. It's not. So I think for people, and I think for most people watching now, wouldn't find that funny.
Yeah. Well,
at all.
even with like, I mean, one of my biggest influences in comedy is Monty Python, and they never really did anything sort of that controversial. As funny as it was, but there was never really sort of any sort of homophobic or racist stuff with Monty Python, was there?
No, there wasn't. But at the same time, yeah, I mean, you have to have some sympathy for certain programs and things. I mean, everyone does. If I look at my comedy output, um, I mean, I don't think really race is something I've dealt with very much,
Mhm.
but I have had references to gay people and things in the comedy from time to time over the years. And I am gay myself, but nevertheless, I think if you looked at some of the comedy from 20 years ago, some little bits of it, you might think the zeitgeist has moved on now, and that's not quite the right way to put that now. It's changed, you know.
Yeah.
So, yes, even in quite relatively short lengths of time, the zeitgeist moves on, and pieces of comedy I look back on sometimes and think that just wouldn't. It's not necessarily about being offensive. It's just some things move on, and sometimes things look old-fashioned and different now compared to 5 years ago. So yes, it changes.
Yeah.
So but you say you could say. I mean, so you could say, therefore, that something I wrote 23 years ago. I should point out we're only talking very small amounts of my comedy output. Most of it has nothing to do with being gay or anything else. But you could maybe point to one or two lines here and there that 23 years ago or something that were written and say, oh, you wouldn't want to say that now. Well, that's changed. And then I suppose you could extrapolate that and say, oh, therefore, what I said was homophobic. I don't think it was homophobic. I mean, of course, being gay doesn't mean you can't be homophobic, but I don't think it was being homophobic. I think so. You can't just always judge people by something that was 25 years ago. Different things are acceptable to be said, and there are different things that society is dealing with. But yes, the world changes.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've forgotten the question. It was a brilliant answer, but I've forgotten what the original question was.
Well, I guess it was just talking about that. Yeah, we could talk about Little Britain and Forty Towers, weren't we? Really, and I mentioned Monty Python there. They didn't really, wasn't too on the nose with that. I mean, I think even with, I have a friend that said, well, I found Little Britain offensive with homophobic because of the Matt Lucas character. I'm the only gay in a village. I'm like, well, Matt Lucas is gay. I'm not even sure that is meant to be homophobic because the guy
Well,
David. Yeah.
I don't think it is homophobic, but
No.
I think the other person is right in a way that the zeitgeist has moved on. When was Little Britain? 10 years ago, longer?
Mm-hmm.
But they probably wouldn't write that sketch now, and that sketch probably wouldn't go on television now. Things have moved on. People have a different attitude. So what that was dealing with a particular sort of, with the mood of the people and with the sort of attitudes people had then.
Mm-hmm.
And I found it funny, I must say, 12 years ago. I didn't find it homophobic or offensive. But now I would probably find it less funny. And not offensive exactly, but less funny, a little bit of, well, not offensive, but I'm feeling a bit sort of, sort of offensive.
Dated, I suppose. Yeah.
So I understand their point, and that doesn't mean that they were being offensive or that they were being homophobic. And it doesn't also mean, I think a lot of the fear you get, especially from the right wing, is that we're going to be laughing less and less. What's going to be left will become more and more politically correct. I think it's just we'll be laughing at different things. Things change. So with things we will laugh at now, we wouldn't have laughed at 12 years ago because something will have become funny now that wouldn't have made sense then. So it's always altering.
So who are your comedy like influences, as a young comedian when you started?
Well, I've been asked this question before. Not many people really. I mean, when I started, which when I was 21 or 19, when I actually did my very first show at university, I didn't really understand much about, I hadn't seen much stand-up comedy, and I didn't really understand the genre. In fact, when I went on stage for the first time, I didn't even know that you're supposed to basically prepare some material. I assumed that comedians just went and sort of made things up. So the first time I went on stage, I literally had no concept of what stand-up comedians did, other than the fact they held a microphone. So the first time I went on, I just went on and said, well, can anyone name a fruit? And then I would sort of improvise off what they said. So there weren't many influences. I didn't know much stand-up comedy. So, and I hope, well, I think so, more or less kept it like that since. I haven't been influenced hugely by many people very much. And other than sometimes in a procedural way. I mean, for example, American comedians, I've been sometimes influenced by the way they go about things, the way they start the show in a technical, it's not about the content or anything like that necessarily, but the way the sort of discipline with which, not all, but a lot of American comedians go about starting and structuring things. So yes, I've more or less created most of my comedy in a vacuum, really. When I started in London doing the open spots properly as a new comedian when I was about 22, 23. I remember a lot of people saying, "Oh, well, you're doing a different thing to other comedians, and you're unusual or whatever." But I'd never planned that. I just did the sort of comedy that seemed to me the most obvious. I just did and I still do really. And so I certainly don't plan to be original or different or anything else. In fact, they say if you try to be original, you won't be. And I think if you try to be different or weird, then you end up being wacky and so on. So I think one can only just do what one wants to do at all times. And I suppose it's always a mistake, I think, to do what you think people want. You have to do what you want to do, rather than. I mean, I do see different changes in the comedy world and what sort of comedy seems to be the most fashionable, what's winning the awards and what isn't, and so on. And sometimes one thinks, well, if I did something a bit more like that, would I be more successful? But then you think, well, I don't think I could do that. Well, I could do that if I wanted to, but I'm better off doing what I want to do. And I think attempting to be someone else or do something differently always is the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you've been deemed as a comedy genius by different journalists, and I suppose people make the comparison. Well, Russell Brand, I suppose, is very influenced by your work. I think some of your fans get a bit angry because they think he copies you, but you guys work together quite closely. You have like quite a fun relationship together?
Well, we work together. We don't work together now. It was a long time ago.
Yeah,
that was what was 2004, 5, that was 15, 16, 17 years ago, a long time ago. But we did do a double act for a while together, and I think clearly two people are going to influence each other, but I think he admitted in his book that it was more that he was influenced by me, and quite a lot of, I think, some of the mannerisms and certain things were very much influenced by me. But and I know that some people get a little bit annoyed, but I do also think there's a lot of other stuff going on with Russell. He's a very talented man, and he has a charismatic and all sorts of other things. And the idea that simply by adopting one or two mannerisms of mine and some other thoughts, that somehow, I think there's more to it. That's not the only reason for his success. And I'm still friends with him, and I still see him time to time, and he's still as eccentric as ever. And in his own, yes, he's an eccentric man, and because he's been through lots of phases. I mean, he sort of went through the sort of being a comedian phase, and then he was sort of film star phase, and then he was a sort of the sort of social commentator activist phase, and then it was a sort of family man phase, and don't know what his next phase is. And that's not to say he hasn't continued to be a comedian and other things throughout that, but he's been through phases when he's sort of focused on particular things.
Mhm.
But anyway, I've always sort of thought to myself, well, I'll always just be a comedian. But now, well, I don't know. We'll see. I hope. But going back to what I said at the beginning, I'm sort of, I always think it's best to prepare for the worst, and if things are better, so I'm preparing myself for the worst, and the worst to me is the tour, and all comedy gets all cancelled in the autumn. We go backwards, and then we find ourselves in a very different industry, and then I might have to think, well, what's my next phase?
Yeah. Have you been able to get on any quiz shows over the last COVID year? Like, because you could do lots and lots of different quiz shows. I've seen you on
Not so
plenty.
much. I mean, they haven't been filming so many things, I suppose, because of the lockdown. I haven't been filming something in a couple of weeks or something, and there was something that went out a little while ago that had been recorded prior to lockdown, and I think they had held it back because they obviously wanted to hold things so they had something to put out later until such the time as things. I suppose it won't probably be till the autumn when they start recording TV shows again. If you were a TV producer, would you be filming in June? Probably not. I mean, there's too many risks that it's all going to be cancelled again. So that'll probably be the autumn before those things happen again.
Yeah.
And then of course, there are some things. The sort of silver lining to the COVID thing has been, I suppose, the Zoom show thing. And that is something that I don't think if it hadn't been for COVID and lockdown, maybe there would have been Zoom shows. I don't know, but it's sort of something that has been born of it's a genre that has been born of COVID that may never have really happened as a genre for entertainment. And it's been really fun. And it's been, I think, a lifeline to me, gives me something to do, and to my connoisseurs, my fans who tune in to watch me, especially when in the dark days of the winter, when it's a Saturday night and you can't go anywhere, and they can have a glass of wine and watch the show, and we can have a bit of a chat at the end, and it's sort of it's a nice thing for us all to do. And I still don't know. I just don't know whether once COVID is all over, whether the Zoom show is going to be a genre that continues. Maybe not every month, but from time to time, people, and of course you've got the advantage, they don't all have to be even in the same country. I can do one to Australia, or I can do one to the UK from Australia, and so and so. And it allows you to reach people who can't necessarily come to a show at the moment for whatever reason. And whether that be just a new genre, a new aspect, a sort of a new dividend from the COVID, a sort of silver lining to the terrible things that happened with COVID, or whether once it's all over, people will just think, I never ever want to see a Zoom show again in my life. I've had enough of it. I mean, I enjoyed it, but I want to go to a live show. Stuff that.
Yeah. Like
So
the Zoom
I don't
quizzes.
know which way it's going to go.
Yeah, it's like the Zoom quizzes. Did you do many of them? The Zoom quizzes? I can't do another one, I don't think.
I don't think I've done any. I think, and I've managed to keep clear of a lot of these things that some people say, and they say, oh, it's all the family and various in-laws. It's a Zoom. We all chat on Zoom, and it can go on for hours on end. Apparently, I've managed to avoid those sort of things.
You avoided well.
But there are some things, there are some times, I suppose, like talking to my manager, maybe. And normally I would go to my manager's house, or we'd meet up in London or something to discuss things. There have been times when the two of us have just had a Zoom thing to go over something. So maybe that will be something that will happen a bit more. Sometimes we'll say, look, it's just not convenient for me to come. Let's do one on Zoom, which sometimes just is a little bit easier than being on the phone. But I don't see it fundamentally altering. I mean, people. I think you're talking to alter some things. I think there'll be offices. I think people will still go to offices, but there'll be more flexibility. It might be that people only go in 3 days, and there's a bit of flexi. This desk is John's on Monday to Wednesday, and it's Sharon's Thursday, Friday, sort of thing. And they swap round, and you don't necessarily have to have a desk for everyone. But I think there will still be people wanting to go to offices and meet other people, because that's a very important part of feeling sometimes if you're part of company and that sort of exchange of ideas you have. And I also know from people in business, in normal businesses, that they say that nothing makes up for actually just meeting people when you're doing a big deal or selling something. To actually go and meet the people, get to know them, and then discuss the deal. And rather than just on Zoom, it can be, and it can just be painfully, difficult, and you can't really judge the other person anyway, and it's very boring, and it feels. So I don't think it's going to change the fundamentals of human nature, which is that people like to meet each other.
Yeah, I suppose when you do your stand-up stuff or Zoom up stuff, I suppose on Zoom, you don't have to worry about any potential hecklers that might that might spring up. Could just kind of mute them and kick them out?
Well, I don't know, although they don't have to mute them because they're not unmuted in the first place.
Oh yeah.
I very rapidly didn't bother with the unmuting thing. I unmute people sometimes if they're, because I have people who do like a little play within my show, and I sometimes unmute people to have a chat. But essentially, people are not muted. I did do one Zoom show in the early days for someone else when they had a very complicated system where there were, I don't know, a few hundred people watching, but there were a core of people who were listening and blah, blah, but then you could hear them, and it was ever so complicated technically. And in a way, I found it less helpful because having 30 people sort of laughing on, which is sort of a limit to how many people can normally get, all unmuted, and having them unmuted and laughing, and sometimes it would interrupt the flow of what I was saying. And it was easier just to do it in fact, when I do it, it's just to my own face, because I've set it to go to my own face, not because I like to see my own face, but because I want to check that I'm in the screen and so on. So, I just do it to myself, as it were, and then my manager maybe looks at whether people are laughing and so on. But in the end, you don't really know. We can tell whether people are laughing, and you can tell whether people chat in the chat box saying I've enjoyed it, and also you can tell because people buy a ticket for the next show. But in terms of the exact details of whether or not a particular brand new joke works, and you can't really tell until you're doing it in front of a live audience.
Yeah.
So yes, I don't bother to unmute people and all that complication. I think you just have to get used to, in the Zoom scenario, doing it to silence, and you have to get used to a different sort of timing. You have to time it differently, and it's a different discipline. In terms of my own shows, of course, this question people ask a lot about hecklers, because you have to remember that when I do my shows, which are generally, I'm doing shows in theatres to people who've all come to see me, you're not going to get many hecklers. Occasionally, you can have someone who joins in a fun way, or says something very clever or amusing about something. And that's not really heckling, that's sort of fun, and they're joining in. But in terms of what you call a heckler, when someone says, get off your taxi, this sort of whatever, you're not going to get that very often as an audience of people who come to see you, unless you had someone who's in there for the wrong reason, in which case you just shut them up. And then the rest of the time, I'm normally, in terms of live events, doing sort of clubs that are quite nice, or some sort of trendy cabaret night, when you're also not likely to get many hecklers. But obviously, if I do, I can cope with it. But it's not the uppermost thing in my mind, in a way.
Well, what is the best way to deal with that, though, as a comedian? I guess did you learn how to deal with that as a younger comedian when you were kind of in the bars and sort of the
Well,
clubs?
yes. I mean, in the early days, sometimes I wouldn't. In the early days, sometimes my gigs weren't going very well. Then you've got a heckler, that can be real difficulties. Although not always, because I remember once in Belfast doing a show in a difficult. It was the Empire in Belfast, which was a difficult room to play. I'm not saying it's a difficult now, but it was certainly difficult for me then.
Yeah.
In a technical way. And I remember someone saying, "Oh, you're rubbish, get off," or something. But actually, then that allowed me to say something to the heckler, and then And then people started to get on my side because I put the heckler down. And then I think the heckler maybe even came up to me at the end afterwards. And actually, the whole gig turned round to my favour. I think the heckler came up to me at the end and said they did it deliberately to help me. Actually, sometimes it can. Yes, in terms of heckling, I think I've never had sort of heckle put down as sort of oven ready, as Boris Johnson would say, as such. I mean, I tend to just deal with the truth of the situation. And most of the time it's in good nature and you can have a laugh about what's been said. And occasionally you can just talk about the ludicrousness of it. I mean, if I've got, 199 people who all enjoy my show and one person doesn't like it and they say, oh, you don't like it, it's ludicrous. And you can point out the ludicrousness of what they're saying, and you can very quickly turn 199 people, well, they're already on your side, but you can very quickly turn them against that person if they're not against them already. And you can, you can shut that person up, really, to the point where they are humiliated and they don't want to say anything, or unless they're just drunk, and just, in which case they could just be taken away. And you have to remember, with a lot of, and that happens in a lot of, if you go and see a lot of established comedians in big theatres, they'll just be, if someone heckles, they're just taken away. So, a lot of, and to be honest, it's very self-indulgent of the comedian. You have to, not the comedian, of the heckler. You have to remember that, if Jimmy Carr is in front of 4,000 people who are all loving his show, and one person wants to shout a load of drunken rubbish, yes, it can be quite entertaining to see him put down, and everyone laughs at his funny put down. He's brilliant, well done, Jimmy. And if they say a second heckle, yes, maybe it's funny to hear the second put down from Jimmy. Yes, brilliant. Beyond that, it's boring. I mean, people want to hear. They've paid to see Jimmy Carr's comedy show. They haven't paid to see him in some prolonged spat with someone. So they just remove these people.
Yeah. I suppose post-COVID, you're itching to get back on to have that environment again. I suppose. Are you looking forward to get back out there?
Absolutely, to get back onto the live. I've done 2 live shows, I think, since one was a club thing in a nice club place in Reading that just somehow happened by miracle in August. There were various restrictions, but there were loads of other shows that were all dotted throughout the year, and they all got cancelled for one reason or another. They fell into some tier or something happened, but this one happened, and there was one other show, a show of my own, socially distanced, in an art centre, that was in December, and that somehow, again, only just happened, just as it was all happening. The day I left for the show, I was in tier 2 and moved into tier 3 that day. That morning, I moved into tier 3. By the time I got home, I'd moved into tier 4. I'd only left my own house for about 12 hours. It was already gone through 2 tiers. And so that somehow miraculously happened. And then I think the whole country went into lockdown shortly afterwards. So yes, I'll be very much looking forward to doing some real live shows. The other thing, going back to hecklers, to point out is that it's important to remember with hecklers that, because I think comedians, especially new comedians, sometimes feel very sort of, or someone's heckled and it's like, oh my God, I'm under attack and oh dear. And one feels on the defensive, and it feels like a very frightening position to be in. But it's important to remember that, with very, very rare exceptions, and that there can be exceptions, but generally hecklers don't really mean much harm. It's all in good nature, Generally, it's just a bit of a laugh. And I remember doing a show, this was probably 15 years ago, and doing some club show. It's just before Christmas, I remember it, and it was in some club with about 250 people. and it was a bit rowdy. And I don't think it went too well for me. And there were all these women who were all in hen party, or they were all part of one company, or I don't know, they were all together. And they were particularly vociferously heckling me. And then I was sort of fighting a battle with them, a battle which I think I lost, because I think in the end, everyone was saying, "Get off, boo!" And I was sort of, but you have to remember, it was like boo, but it wasn't really, it was a bit
like
of
panto.
it what?
Like panto booing. Yeah.
Sport. And then I remember, then as I left, I had to go down some little dark alley to get to where my car was parked. And there were all these women, all 25 of them or whatever, and they were the ones who'd been heckling me from the moment I got on stage. And I thought, oh dear, you know. And then as I went past, they all said, "Oh yeah, happy Christmas, and we enjoyed your performance." And but these are the people who were heckling. "Get off your rubbish from the," you know. I mean, you could argue whether or not they should have done it. Did they spoil it? Whatever. But not, you know. The point is, it wasn't personal. It didn't really mean much, you know. But and so over the years, there have been all sorts of people who've said all sorts of things to me. And of course, sometimes it is personal and very unpleasant, but most of the time it isn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I bet you're. I can't wait to see you back on stage and doing your thing, Paul. It's gonna. Hopefully, it won't be too long.
Oh, thank you, Lawrence.
Yeah, so it's been great talking to you today, Paul. I'm not quite as nocturnal as you, I'm afraid.
Oh, you're going to bed now. It's 20 past 1 in the morning.
It's 20 past 1 in the morning. Is that like noon for you, or what's?
Well, this is like, well, it's just starting now. I should point out that to the viewers that when Lawrence made a message to me, when do you want to do? We said we would do this day or something, and what time would you like to do it? I said, well, maybe 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. or dawn, like 6 a.m. And then he was saying, well, I do tend to go to bed more like 1, and sort of gently suggesting that it could be a bit earlier. But anyway, I'm glad we got it done. We went to 20 past 1, so that's good.
We did, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you on stage, Paul. I'm really looking forward to seeing that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right, thanks for your time, Paul.
Thanks, Lawrence.